Hi, this is Aaron Azrod, and welcome to the 72nd episode of the Truth Island podcast. The medieval legend of Faust speaks of a man named Faust who is highly intelligent and successful in life, but becomes bored. There are many iterations of this story, but the basic premise is that in his boredom, Faust makes a deal with the devil in which he is provided unlimited knowledge and pleasure and a servant that can grant him magical powers. The deal goes that for a number of years, Faust will have this demon at his disposal, but at the end of the term, his soul will belong to the devil and will be internally enslaved. Faust uses his powers for obvious pleasures to seduce a woman named Gretchen who bears him a child, but she ends up drowning her own child. In some versions, God saves Faust from his unholy bargain with the devil. In other versions, his soul actually does go to the devil and he spends all eternity in hell. In a more modern sense, however, the term Faustian bargain has come to mean doing something unsavory or corrupt in order to reap the rewards of material and carnal pleasure. For example, an employee who is asked by his boss to lie or forge documents to show record profits would be said to be committing a Faustian bargain in order to keep his high-paying job and maintain a lifestyle that he deems worthy of his station. Often, Faustian bargains come in the form of committing acts which will most likely harm others, but will be of direct benefit to ourselves. A corrupt politician taking money from lobbyists, for example, who may not have the best interests of the nation, would be a prime example. As the politician compromises his or her soul for monetary gain and the hopes of being reelected at the expense of the welfare of the nation and perhaps even their own sense of morals and ethics. Whether or not you believe in the idea of an ethereal soul, we can think of the soul as also being a stand-in for our values. Each time that we make deals or compromise our values for something that we think we want, we are in turn making a Faustian bargain. One need not be dragged to the depths of hell to experience these consequences, but perhaps the compromise lives and festers within the belly of a person's subconscious. Joining me to help discuss when we might be making a Faustian bargain without even realizing it, I am once again joined by Sam. Sam, help me save my soul, please.
You got it, Aaron. Thanks. Thanks for having me back on your show. It's always good to be here.
Anytime.
Yeah, I think that was a really succinct, great explanation. I haven't read a lot of the kind of primary sources on the Faustian bargain, so your explanation just really opens things up for me there. I one of my favorite movies is "Oh Brother, Where Art Thou?" And I was thinking about that as you were talking, how there's a young black man who meets, someone whom he calls the devil at a crossroads in rural Alabama, and in exchange for his soul, he learns how to play the guitar like no one else. Like he just becomes this amazing guitarist. And Delmar, one of the kind of the goofy guys of the three, he goes, "You sold your everlasting soul for that?" And the young black man's like, "Yeah, I mean," and then when you watch him play, you're like, okay, I get why you did what you did. And I think that's, like more of the traditional kind of view of the exchange, the deal with the devil. I liked how you kind of brought it into our everyday lives. Kind of the practical application of it is that working a job we don't like, or mistreating others, or you and I have talked about how people stop doing what they're passionate about for their most immediate desires to go unfulfilled. There's an exchange, and it has to do with, I think, losing and recovering, hopefully, our authentic self.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think like the Twilight Zone is a prime example where it's always super obvious who the devil is, right? He's usually a thin, good-looking man in a suit, has an evil laugh. There's a cloud of smoke. He's got like a contract, and you're signing it with blood. And in life, it's never that obvious, right? It's never that obvious of some evil person. But most of us, when we're making this deal with the devil, we're actually making this deal with ourselves, right? It's that's the really important thing here to do. Yes, like in my example, there might be a boss who's asking you to do something unsavory, like lie about a report or lie about, financial statements and so forth. But look at all the nasty things that we do to one another. Look how many times you've worked with somebody and they threw you under the bus because they were either afraid or they wanted to kind of get ahead. And I think these are the kind of deals that we're making internally in our own mind without even realizing it.
Totally. And I consider myself, I guess, kind of blessed that I haven't had to be in the situation of a politician or a head of state or something like that, where my decisions affect millions and millions of people. I have struck my own Faustian bargains, which have hurt myself and those around me. I think it comes back to the concept of identity and selfhood, because we like you said, it's a struggle kind of within ourselves, with ourselves. No one talks to you more than you. It's this concept of self-talk, the voices that we kind of acquire throughout our lives, through our family of origin and school and different kind of organizations that we're part of, voices that kind of continue to ring inside of our head and dictate our actions. And so what we're really talking about is kind of a wrestling match with ourselves, learning how to discern the voices, not in a schizophrenic way, like people are talking to us or I hear voices, but just the kind of influences that have shaped us and continue to shape us. And some voices, for some reason, just continue to ring out louder than others. And so much of my adulthood has been taken up with kind of parsing those voices out, figuring out whose voices those are, which ones I need to listen to, why I continue to listen to certain negative ones, and why I don't kind of continue to grow into my authentic self.
So I think that there's two major reasons why this happens, and one is opportunity and the other is fear. Let's just focus on opportunity first. And it's really funny, Sam, because when I was younger, I thought the word opportunist was a good word. I actually thought, oh, that guy has ambition. He's an opportunist, and I used to equate that word with, I did not know better. I actually thought it was a good word, and I meant it, a young, aggressive guy going out there in the world and making something for himself. And I think our media glorifies that as well, right? Because if we look at the protagonist, if we look at the main characters of a lot of our movies, they're not saints, right? Like a lot of these, and I talked on a previous episode with my friend Kenny, a lot of our protagonists are not saints. They're just really intelligent, really able to kind of maneuver and take opportunities. They see like a vital weakness and then they kind of exploit that vital weakness to win at the end of the day. And I think a lot of young people in America are seeing that, and they see that behavior is getting rewarded. And I think the most prime example is in the realm of politics. Okay, it's come to a point, regardless of where you fall on the political spectrum. I think as Americans, we just blindly accept that our politicians are corrupt to some degree. We whether you're Republican or Democrat, it's almost the ipso de facto thought pattern is that they're all corrupt. And I'm scratching my head being like, well, whose fault really is this? Is it the politician's fault? Is it our fault? And I think we all have our hands bloodied in this because our society is being set up not to reward the most virtuous or the most wise amongst us. It's actually being set up to reward the most clever and the most opportunist amongst us. So I think that the individual is obviously making unsavory acts, but then we're also living in a society that applauds that and doesn't really levy any consequences when this occurs.
Totally agree. I think our political environment and this is putting it mildly, is toxic. But it's kind of a representation of our cultural values. It's kind of our cultural values writ large, is what we're seeing in characters like, honestly, like Donald Trump and others. This kind of toxicity, and I think for example, not to get, I definitely don't want to go down the Trump path today or really ever, but in conversation, but just to say that, we, as a culture, and I've felt this in my own life with influence within my own family, that it doesn't really pay to be a nice guy. Like integrity and like being nice and kind of docile, like those are not good cultural values, and they won't be rewarded. And so if you really want to grow into your authentic self and live your best life, you need to become more assertive, you need to become more aggressive, you need to cut corners. In some ways you need to abandon integrity. And I kind of went through that process myself, in not in a political way, but like in college and sort of towards the end of college and after college. I had been a pretty sort of nice guy, pretty harmless guy up until that point. And then, my brother kind of brought it to my attention that, I would get a whole lot more attention from girls if I was more assertive and even a little bit more aggressive. And I sort of took pages out of his book over the last decade. And you know what? It didn't really pay off. I felt like I struck my own Faustian bargain during that period of time, and I sort of lost sight of my authentic self. And it's like I'm longing to like come up for air is what it feels like. I'm just like in the deep end of the pool, coming up for air, to breathe again, to live again, not to necessarily return to 2010 or 2005 when life seemed to be simpler, and I like it was more like Garden of Eden before the fall, like a stage of innocence. But there is a feeling of that. I think what I'd like to do is kind of reach back into that part of my life and then sort of bring it into where I'm at now, and become more of the kind, life-giving, and even safe person that I think that I really am.
Yes. Yeah. It's funny because I actually got that same exact advice for picking up women. Like, dude, bro, you got to dress up, man. Let's wear some darker jeans, spruce some things up a little bit. And what I actually found is that the more aggressive I was, the more I tried to dress up and so forth, it actually just completely backfired because I was not being my authentic self. Girls have actually fallen into my lap when I was wearing sweatpants or some like dirty undershirt and like hadn't shaved in 3 days, and they were like, "Oh, well, that guy's really into psychology or whatever it is." And when I was in my stride, right, and my default self is a guy who wears t-shirts with Star Wars on them and sweatpants. When I'm in my natural habitat and my natural clothing and my natural attitude, and I'm really a nice guy, like I can't help it. I've tried my best to change, and the one rule that I will change is that I don't let people take advantage of me. And I still think you can call yourself a nice guy but not be a doormat. And I think every biblical text, I think every religion says don't be a doormat. Like, you can be a nice guy and treat people with dignity and respect, but don't be a doormat. And that I fundamentally agree with. However, I want to share another story with you, Sam. I remember I worked with a colleague, a female teacher, and she said, "Yeah, I'm mean and bitchy and I'm proud of it," or something like. And she just like outwardly said this, at like a faculty meeting, and people applauded it, or people were like okay with her saying that. And I was just shocked. I was like, you're outwardly professing that you're a mean, bitchy person and that we should respect you and that this is a wonderful thing. I'm like, you're an educator. You're an educator of young minds, and you're outwardly professing that you give in to bad behavior. And she actually was like the type of person that, if you were a loose thread, if you were holding her back, or if you were in the way, she threw you under the bus. She ran to the principal and ratted you out, instead of like being like, "Hey, I really want to talk to you about this. Could we, like, no negotiating, just the pure Machiavellian, like, I'm here to rise to the top and I take no prisoners kind of attitude." And that kind of personality can only exist in ecosystems and environments in which they're allowed to flourish. And that's why I think it's not just her fault, it's also the school's fault and the larger society's fault for being like, "Yeah, girl, you go ahead and take no prisoners and chop people's heads off," or whatever it is. And I'm like, that's our fault.
Yeah, totally. I even had an uncle, and this is, by way of extension of kind of not just cultural values, but also family values within my own family system, who blatantly told me, he's like, yeah, girls like to be mistreated or something like that. It almost sounds kind of kinky or something, but not in that sense. Just like how, again, going back to this aggressiveness and this assertiveness that was sort of being prescribed to me and reinforced. This, to your point, reinforced to me by sort of the values of my family as a whole. And so as I sort of started to lean into my 20s and wanted to be more kind of authentic and sort of consistent with my own family's values, I felt like I needed to sort of abandon the the person that I really was, and sort of put on this front of, again, assertiveness, aggressiveness, trying to put myself out there. And I'm just bringing that situation up, kind of my kind of love life, romantic life, as a kind of emblematic of, I think, the values as a whole of my family that I was trying to live up to. But in the process, I really lost sense of myself. And to go back to your point as well, I think I've had the most success. I've gotten the best kind of attention when I am just myself. In fact, I had a counselor tell me at one point, like, this was kind of in the middle of my 20s, kind of in the middle of figuring out the kind of person I wanted to be. He said, it's almost like you would kind of scorn the woman who would like come to your side when you're sick and bring you chicken noodle soup in favor of someone who would mistreat you. So as I was like learning how to sort of mistreat people, especially, I think, in a dating context, or at least take people for granted and view it too pragmatically, I was actually opening myself up to be mistreated.
Absolutely. And that advice about like your true friends will bring you chicken noodle soup when you're sick. I heard the same, some guy in the gym told me the same exact thing. So I'm glad us good people are able to like sniff each other out and be like, "Oh yeah, yeah, the chicken noodle soup. We're all on the same we're all on the same page with that one." And you're absolutely right. I think that you when you disrespect other people, when you make these Faustian bargains and start throwing people under the bus, you actually don't really love yourself all that much, because you think, oh, I love myself so much that I'm going to sacrifice all these plebeians so that think of a chessboard. Like, I'm just going to sacrifice all the pawns so that, like I can, but no, it's like you actually don't love yourself, because if you loved yourself, you would be upset when you tell a lie. You would be upset when you compromise your virtues and your principles. That's actually a sign of true love. True love is not compromising all of your virtues and all of your values to get ahead. I actually think that's a lack of self-love, because a lot of these politicians, what do they want? Power and all. They want to be loved, don't they, Sam? They want to be loved. They want people to speak highly of them. And it's funny because the people who actually get high in politics, we actually don't think very highly of them. For the most part, we don't, because we know that they're all making these corrupt Faustian bargains every single day, and they get the exact opposite of what it is that they wanted. They're not loved. They're not spoken with in high regard. History books will most likely not be all that kind to them. And I think that there's no other way but to not compromise the soul. Like, you have to be true to your soul. And again, going back, it's not, you're not signing anything on a dotted line. It's just like, hey, I'm Sam. I'm a great guy, and I treat women with respect. And I don't play these games where I treat them like dirt, or I don't answer their phone call or their text message for 10 days to make it seem like I'm busy, right? And that's a Faustian bargain right there. Like, oh well, I totally have time to answer this text message, but I got to be the impressive all. I'm like, no, I'm done playing that game. If I've got the time, I'll text you back in like 10 seconds if I see your message. And that's Aaron being true to who I am. And you can control that as Sam. I can control that as Aaron. I'm wondering, how do we open the eyes of the greater world so that they can start valuing these things again? Because I feel like we're our visions, like I feel like the whole nation has cataracts right now, and we can't see what it is that really matters. We're deluded into thinking that these Machiavellian figures are super strong and super powerful. And I'm wondering, like, how exactly do we get people to see again?
Yeah, man, so many thoughts there. Great question. Ravi Zacharias, he was a Christian leader, Indian immigrant to the U.S., died recently. Kind of a well-known guy in the evangelical world, an apologist, so kind of a defender of the faith, kind of an intellectual leader of the evangelical wing of things. And he was based in Atlanta. That's kind of how I knew of him. I was living in Atlanta for a couple of years. And, he died recently. And right after his death, some scandals came out about him. And it's totally public knowledge now. So, you can check that out on Google. But it was just this realization that, man, we all thought we knew Ravi. And what a disappointment that, all these, backroom operations were happening in the darkness, and some really shady shit was going down. And then it's like, well, what would you expect from somebody who named a ministry for himself? It was Ravi Zacharias of Ravi Zacharias Ministries. And so there's this kind of exaltation of putting yourself at the front of the line. And I again, not to go down the Trump path, and sorry for keep bringing him up, but because I know it's a divisive topic, but even within the evangelical world, 60 million evangelicals voted for Trump. And it's like, Trump represents everything that we're not about. Growing up in the 90s in youth group and church and Christian schools, and like, in terms of every point of ethics, Trump is not what we sort of the evangelical agenda put forward, in terms of like sexual values and family values, and in terms of leadership and putting yourself first in the line. Like that was never what we talked about. And so, there's a confusion there in the evangelical camp about the kind of values we want to put forward. And I think the question is, what do we want to gain from being somebody like Ravi Zacharias, who names the ministry for himself and is doing things that shouldn't be done? And what do we want to gain from supporting someone like Trump? Is it control? And I think that's so, unfortunately, and in the Christian world, it's control. We want to be in charge. We want control. And, if you look at the Bible, that's not what Jesus is about. Jesus is the person who washes his disciples' feet. He says that, if you want to be first, you have to set yourself last. He says, if you want to find yourself, and you have to lose yourself. If you want to gain the world, you sort of have to lose the world. It's just this constant paradox. And I think we have to ask ourselves, what are we trying to gain? And as I ask myself, as I struck this Faustian bargain with, I'm sorry to call my brother out, but my older brother in 10 years ago, as I was thinking about how to be, more successful in the dating world, what was I trying to gain? I think it was some control. I think it was, I wanted to be like God in my own environment. That goes back to the Garden of Eden. That's how the serpent tricked Adam and Eve into eating of the fruit, was this false promise that if you eat this fruit, this bargain, then you will be like God, and you will actually see good and evil in a way that you can't see it now. I think there was some of that for me. It was a desire for control, but I think it was also for me, and I think maybe I'm a little different than like a Ravi Zacharias or a Trump, is that I felt kind of this internal sense of lack and inadequacy and insufficiency that I was trying to sort of account for or cover, kind of a shame or a nakedness, an internal nakedness that I was trying to cover, feeling like, yeah, I have been really inadequate in the area of girls and dating. And I feel this kind of patheticness that I want to kind of make up for or account for. And so I'm going to take my brother's advice. And in the process, I'm going to lose sight of my authentic self.
I think you're absolutely right. I mean, even I think of my own girlfriend. Like I met by inviting her to a Buddhist temple, right? And that's not like a cool, badass leather jacket motorcycle thing to do, right? Like, what kind of guy is like, hey, would you like to go on a date with me? I'm gonna visit a Buddhist temple. And sure enough, she went along. And I'm like, that's an example. Like and that's how I caught, a real that's how I caught somebody, is by being myself, right? Like being completely geeky into religion, into my things that I like. I was able to attract my girlfriend for that. Whereas and throughout this happened, I think I had just maybe turned 30, or I was 29, and it's like I had spent my entire 20s being the opposite of my nature, going to bars, going to clubs, wearing nice dress shirts and crap. And I attracted nothing. I attracted maybe a few mosquitoes, but but nothing of any substance whatsoever. And I hate talking too much about politics, but I know that I did watch this thing with Donald Trump, and the one thing that stands out is that the man, I think on Air Force One or on his private jet, the man has like a golden toilet. And there's something like when you think of Christ, and you just think of religion, all religion in general, and you juxtapose, like, oh, the guy has a golden toilet, and I'm like, there's just something that's like, and that, I'm not judging. I'm not. If you have the money to have a golden toilet, enjoy your golden toilet. Okay. What I am trying to say is that if you are a person of religious conviction, that doesn't really seem like a figurehead that matches that criteria. And I think I think very few politicians match that criteria, because overwhelmingly most politicians are extremely wealthy, whether they're Democrats or Republicans. They are all millionaires. You'd be hard pressed to find someone in the Senate who earns like 40,000 a year or something. Like
Yeah.
they're all incredibly rich. So all of these figureheads don't really match religious ideals. They really, really, really don't. And I think that if the religious community, and I think this happens, I think there needs to be an awakening, both with religious people, even with atheists and so forth. It's like, what do we really value in human beings? Like, do we want to value a human being because they have a golden toilet and they're really wealthy and they have a big house? Like, we love figures that have big houses, right? And when someone from a big house talks, we're like, oh, big house man is talking, he's rich, he must be wise and knows something. But it's like, is that really what we value? And the way I think of this, Sam, is even my own. I used to value big house people, because I thought, oh well, you could never have become this rich if you weren't wise and smart, right? And that was my thinking. But now I'm starting to realize that, I'm not trying to generalize here. I'm sure there's some really rich people that are awesome, and donate, and volunteer on a Sunday at a clothing drive and so forth. But what I am realizing, that is, if you have a big house, you might be a good person, but I think there's also other people who have big houses who did a lot of unsavory and nasty things to kind of get there, right? They may have thrown a lot of people under the bus. They may have, they were the guy who fudged the financial reports and so forth. And I'm like, they can teach me how to be corrupt, and they can teach me to be an opportunist, but are they going to teach me how to be a good person? And if they themselves are not a good person, what makes me think that they're going to have my best interest at heart if we elect them? Like, if I elect a really, really rich man to be my senator, or to be in the House of Representatives, or to be president, they're really good at becoming rich themselves. They're very good at self a grand of building up their own wealth. But why the hell are they going to give two craps about me when their whole life has been about them?
Yeah. I always worry about being too becoming too preachy on this podcast, or too sermonic, because my domain is the kind of the Christian world. I'm kind of steeped in the Christian world. I haven't always enjoyed that, but it's just true. I my both my grandfathers were pastors, and my parents ran a Christian ministry when I was growing up. And I've spent a lot of my life in the kind of the Christian, and I would say evangelical bubble, although I feel an extreme dissonance with most sort of evangelical people. I just want to say, so sorry if I get too sermonic on this podcast, but I do think as you were talking, this idea that we can, again, in the words of Christ, we can gain the whole world, but if we forfeit our soul, like, what good is that? And I like that, because you don't have to be Christian to believe in that, and it was central to sort of the life and ministry of Christ, his time on earth, and his disciples did not understand that, he was kind of what he was here for. Most people didn't while he was alive, and it wasn't until he went through the resurrection and everything like that things came more clearly. But that idea of you can and again, I like the way you unpacked the idea of the soul. We're not just talking about a Christian or Jewish concept of the soul or some even religious concept of the soul. We're talking about really the kind of our essentially our authentic self, our core values, and even our core stories, and living in a way that's congruent with all of that. We can climb to the top, but if we lose sight of ourselves, what do we have at the end of the day? And that's the question I would pose to people. And I would add to your point that like the development of character, David Brooks from the New York Times has written a lot about sort of like character, and and not even from like a religious standpoint, more just sort of from a kind of a common humanity standpoint. Like the development of character over the acquisition of material things or any other sort of achievements that we can have is really what it means to live the good life. And that's something that I want to spend my life exploring. I'll say one other thing from the life of Christ, the kind of the sayings of Christ. He there's a parable in the book of Luke, and there's a rich man, and it's kind of a rich and poor kind of parable, and this man comes up to Jesus and says like, hey Christ, like tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me. It's kind of a classic like inheritance battle story, which are still in existence every day. And Christ is like, I'm not a judge. Like I'm not. You're talking to the wrong person. I don't have the authority to do this. But he kind of says a warning, and he says, our lives do not consist in the abundance of our possessions. And the literal translation of it is, even when our possessions and our achievements abounds, even when it abounds to someone, his life or her life is not made up of his possessions. And I love that idea, because it's just a reminder that there's more than meets the eye, and we need to continue to sort of let the bucket down into the well and draw back up, and do it over and over and over to sort of continue to gauge and to pour into our authentic self.
Absolutely, absolutely. And there's so many people will be like, "Oh, well, that's weakness. You should fight for every penny in that inheritance." And I'm like, you know what? It's okay to put up a little bit of a fight for what you believe is yours, but at the end of the day, if that's going to make or break your character, then it may not be worth all that much. And this also, now I'm going to sound a little sermonic because I'll talk about Buddhism a little bit, in the sense that in Buddhism, there's this an idea, I'm paraphrasing, but there can be no outward mastery until there is inward mastery. It cannot exist. There's no way that you are going to be able to conquer this world or do X, Y, and Z until there is complete, absolute inward mastery. And that means being completely content in poverty, being completely content with what you have, being content with your relations with other people, and making amends or making justice with that. If those things are not in place, you will never, ever conquer the outside. You can call yourself a president or CEO or whatever it is that you want to. You can have titles, but you will never have mastery of the outside world until there is full and absolute mastery of oneself. And I don't know if it's possible to have full mastery of oneself, but you ought to get at a really high level before you think about conquering the mountains and so forth. Okay, on to the second thing that kind of makes people make Faustian bargains, and this is the tougher one: fear. And we have a number of people at work, right? We have the person who's the opportunist who throws people under the bus, but then Sam, and this person I kind of feel for a little bit more. We have the person who's working at an organization, and their boss tells them, if you don't do this, you're fired, or like we'll get rid of you, or if you don't play along with what we're doing here, you're done for, you're fired, good luck finding health insurance and all this other stuff. And this is the person that I feel for a lot, because they're not an opportunist. They're not going out of their way to commit evil acts to get ahead. They're just trying to save what little they have. So I'm wondering if you have any tips for a person that's perhaps making Faustian bargains out of fear.
Yeah, man, dude, you're so good at this podcast thing. Again, I would just kind of my caveat here is like I've never had to be in a situation, where my life literally depended on following orders that I thought were evil or wrong. I've had the freedom to resign from a job if I felt like, things weren't heading in the right direction. But there's a book called They Thought They Were Free that was written in the 50s. And it's about like the ordinary judge, baker, and police officer in Germany in the 1930s, and how they thought they were free until the Nazis came along, the Nazi party, and told them that they really weren't free and they were missing out on all these things. And then it got to the point in 1930s Germany where if they didn't do what the Nazi party said or prescribed, then they would be locked up or banished or killed. And I mean, there's so many different stories in those years leading up to the Second World War. But I've never had to be in that situation, so I feel very naive and very, sort of unqualified to speak. I know that in my own life, there's been a lot of moments of fear. I think I kind of took hook, line, and sinker my brother's advice about dating and about girls and about being more assertive and aggressive. And because I was afraid that if I didn't, I would not be sort of a man after his own heart, and after my family's own heart, in a sense. Like I was trying to, shore up a kind of a sense of inadequacy in myself. That's a little bit different than what you're describing. I also had another instance when I was first a pastor in Iowa. There was an older gentleman in my church who grew up in my church and just felt that everyone was spiritually very lazy and dead. They were just going through the motions, going to church on Sunday, and but they weren't really, they didn't really know what they were doing or really have like a very active, relationship with God. And so he kind of came to me and he said, if you pastor in this, unless you sort of pastor in my way, he kind of viewed himself as a missionary to his own church, to the church I was pastoring. And he said, unless you sort of um, kind of adopt my theology, my approach, my practical ideas about how to reach this congregation, then you are going to be just like everyone else. You're going to be ineffective, and you're going to be kind of contributing to their spiritual condition. And I had a choice to make in that situation. I was like, I can ignore this guy, but if I do, he's going to, sort of make a hard time for me, give me hell. Or I can sort of like forget my own values here and what I think this church needs, and kind of who I am as a believer and a spiritual leader. And I was really torn because ultimately I sort of ignored his advice. I sort of refused to strike a bargain with him to say, I'm going to do it your way because, it's sort of like, if you do it my way, I'll be on your team and I'll make life really good for you, is kind of what he said. And I sort of ignored that. And he ended up becoming a thorn in my side. I didn't become his ally. I didn't become his secret partner in this ministry. And life was hard for me, especially as a 27-year-old pastor. It was distressing because I felt like threatened by him and his sort of rival leadership in our church. But I'm proud of myself looking back on that time because like I stuck to my guns. I stayed true to myself.
I think that was a Faustian bargain right there, Sam. If I ever saw one, I think it was. And let's go to the most extreme version, right? That we think of people living in Nazi Germany, where if they don't make the Faustian bargain, they could literally be shot, right? And it's easy for me and you on our high horses to be like, oh yeah, if I was in Nazi Germany, I would totally. And like, okay, you know what? Like, there's some really good points there, and when your life is on the line like that, that opens up a whole nother can of worms. But what I like about life today, at least, is that the stakes aren't as high as that, and that's why. But the thing is that many people think in our head it is that high. They think that it is that big of a deal. And I'm like, okay, you chose not to make the Faustian bargain. You're like, sir, with all due respect, I'm going to I'm going to preach and I'm going to interpret the Bible the way that I feel is right. And there were consequences for that. He became, like there's consequences. And this happened to me in my teaching career as well, Sam. There were times where I could have made a Faustian bargain and allowed the students to behave in ways that were just unacceptable and quite frankly very dangerous. I could have just turned the other cheek and made the Faustian bargain. But I said, no, I'm going to take this to the next level. And I paid the price. I was fired. Consequences. My income was diminished. My livelihood was diminished. I couldn't, I didn't have money to go to TGI Fridays with the friends and all this other good, all that stuff was just ripped away from me. And there are, like, again, I'm being very serious here. There are consequences when you choose not to make the Faustian bargain. God doesn't just come in and like save you in the last minute. And then, in the movies, the good guy just gets saved the last second. But in real life, that doesn't happen. You do pay the consequences and you do pay the toll. But I think because we're not living in extreme like Soviet era or Nazi Germany, okay, I pay the consequences. I eat a few more, I eat tuna fish sandwiches a little bit more often. I have some more canned soup. But at the end of the day, this is all about cultivating higher self-mastery. Whereas when I'm in situations where my soul is being compromised, I might have external power in the form of higher income, right? So I have external power in terms of higher income, but I have less power in having a more purified soul or purified, for the atheist listening, more purified sense of value. And I think that is really what's important with all the decisions that we make, is that there will be consequences. I'm not naive. I've been through a lot of crap in my life. I'm not telling you that, the good king is going to restore you at the end and it's all going to end happy. I'm not promising you that. What I will say is that in your renewed poverty or whatever, you will have a greater love and you will have you will sleep very well at night and you will have a greater sense of yourself and gain a much higher level of mastery.
I completely agree. And to go back to your friend, the woman who was teaching with you, who was like, I'm a badass
Not my friend, by
bitch.
the
What?
way.
Oh, sorry. Sorry. Your acquaintance, and then how her kind of attitudes were sort of celebrated and exalted. And I bring that up because I think one of the ways we escape this sort of vicious cycle of having to make really hard decisions is like surrounding ourselves with good people. There's nothing like doing life with like healthy people. And I mean, like, especially like emotionally healthy people who have done the hard work of like processing kind of their lives and their stories, and like they're good at telling their story and good at drawing other people's stories out and asking questions and listening in a reflective way that is just really inviting and warm, and people who are kind of in touch with their feelings. And I've talked about this in other podcasts, but I don't think there's any thing on earth like doing life with healthy people. And so there's a Bible verse about, it's actually a quote of an ancient proverb, but bad company ruins good morals. And it's just this idea of like, again, redemptive community and like surrounding yourselves with people who celebrate character development and from a Christian perspective, the fruit of the spirit, like the good stuff of life, like the things that make people good people. And, so there's no replacement. And I would also say, like, I'm definitely an evangelist of therapy. There's nothing like going through therapy, like good counseling, and learning to grapple with your own story, with a certified licensed counselor. Like, these things are, to me, what make a good life. And I'm excited. I'm kind of like not young anymore. I'm not at 21. I'm not 45 yet, but like I'm starting to kind of, in the next 10, 12 years, I'm going to sort of approach like the halfway mark in some ways, and hopefully, God willing. Right. But as I think about the kind of person I want to be and continue to grow into, and the kind of life I want to live, I want to do life with healthy people, and I want to be a healthy a healthy people.
Absolutely. And this might, what I'm about to say might go a little bit against like Christian theology, but I do believe that there is a certain degree of like heaven on earth and hell on earth. And I think that when we refuse to make the Faustian bargains, it will happen in such a way that good people will just magically kind of flock into your life almost. And like you can kind of create a little slice of heaven in your world because now you're a lot poorer, you have a lot less money, but then you're constantly brushing elbows with good people, right? You're constantly brushing elbows, almost as if you are in heaven in a way, because you're constantly brushing elbows with awesome people that got your back, and you have very little to show for yourself in a material sense, but you're very rich in your social life. Whereas if you are, working the corporate game and backstabbing people, yeah, you're very rich in terms of your bank account, but you're extremely poor in the people that you're associating with, because the higher you go up the ladder, the more nastier it becomes and the more vicious it becomes. So in a way, you're kind of creating your own hell on earth by constantly being surrounded by cutthroat people, people who you don't trust, people who are going to backstab you, people who are going to lie to you. So in a way, whether you believe in heaven and hell in the afterlife or in the ethereal sense, the choices you make and the people you surround yourself with, you can kind of determine what paradise or hell that you're living in right here on earth.
I think that's a great insight. Actually, I think that's really consistent with Christian theology and biblical theology, because like even in the history of Israel, in the Bible, like God is sort of constantly bringing them back to the promised land. So like Adam and Eve are banished from Eden, and that's a tragedy. But then through Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, like Israel is born again. The nation of Israel is born, and through Moses and the tabernacle, like the tabernacle is sort of a picture of Eden, and so when they're sort of in communion with God and sort of at peace with each other and sort of in a place of health, it's sort of like they're close to Eden again. And even the design of the tabernacle points to the fruits and the fertility of Eden, and you see that in Solomon's temple as well, when they are sort of in the Holy of Holies and interacting with God and others in a way that's congruent with the universe and as it should be. Like again, they're sort of close to paradise, and I think that we can sort of continue that story in our own lives and create pockets of heaven, and we can definitely create pockets of hell, but I think that you're really onto something there, Aaron.
Thank you, Sam. And I say these things, and again, I'm not trying to dissuade anyone from believing in what they believe in the afterlife and so forth. But if we're really mindful with the deals that we're making and the people that we're surrounding with ourselves, we can take a lot of control over our present day reality. And yeah, it might end up that we have a lot less money and a lot less stuff to show for us. But in the end of the day, I would rather kind of have people that genuinely love me for who I am and genuinely love me because I'm a good guy, not because they're afraid of me, not because I have a powerful title. That's all false. And if we can learn something from the great villains of history, a lot of these guys were really, really paranoid, and they kind of died alone, and they died with like a bullet to the head or in some really, really, really nasty and like gruesome ways, right? So they thought that they were on top. They kind of got taken out on the bottom, if you would. So it's like, like we really, this really is like a Sesame Street level of morality here. It's not that difficult, folks. Like don't make these Faustian bargains. There will be consequences, but in the end, you're going to get a lot more than you lost. Sam, thank you so much for being on the show today.
Thanks for having me, Aaron.
This concludes the 72nd episode of the Truth Island podcast. I'm Aaron Azarad.